You are listening to the Concierge Minister podcast, a place to grow, learn, and be inspired as you discover God's purpose for your life. Here's your host, the pastor you've always wanted without the church, Dr. Kumar Dixit.
Hey. Welcome back to another podcast with the Concierge Minister, Kumar Dixit. Glad that you can join me again. There's a lot of people that have kind of influenced my thinking and have kind of shaped the way that I view my own spirituality. Bart Ehrman is probably one of is on top of that list. N.T. Wright, Rachel Held Evans, Jackie Hill Perry. But there's one person who I've read every one of their books. And before I go on, I do have one listener who emailed me and said, I gush over these authors and I like suck up to them, but this is worth sucking up to Brian McLaren. So about almost 20 years ago, I was driving across country from being a pastor in California, just finished my master's degree. And as I was driving cross country, I was reading a book. And, as a pastor, we're geeks. So I'm not like reading like fiction. I'm reading a book called The Church on the Other Side, Doing Ministry in the Postmodern Matrix. And I think I was somewhere in Texas at a hotel room. And I finally turned to the back of the book. And I was like, who is this guy? And I saw that, Brian McLaren, it was his first book. And it said that he was a pastor in Burtonsville, Maryland. Well, listen to this. I was driving to Burtonsville, Maryland, because that's where my church was, about a mile and a half from Brian's church. I had no idea. And so from a hotel room, I emailed Brian somehow and said, hey, I'm going to be your neighbor. And I definitely sounded very much like a stalker. Wouldn't you agree, Brian?
No, I didn't think that at
all. And about a month or two later, we sat down for coffee at Starbucks off of 198 and started getting better acquainted with both of our churches, very close in proximity. And since then, I've read all of Brian's books. And this new book that's coming out, Brian, How Do I Stay, or Do I Stay Christian, is the title. And I read this book and I texted you last week. I was in Puerto Rico reading this book on the ocean, and it's not a book that you can just speed read. I mean, and luckily, even in the book, there's several places where you go, it may be time for you to sit down and go for a long walk and kind of think about what you just read and come back to this. And I really needed those prompts. So I say all of that to say, welcome to Brian McLaren. Thank you for joining me.
So happy to be with you. See an old neighbor and old friend.
Yeah, it's great. You wrote this book, at least you wrote the book during the pandemic. What was happening in your life? What were you observing around your life that you felt like you needed to write this book at this time?
Well, in many ways, as you know, Kumar, my whole life and ministry have been really about this book, because I grew up in a very strict and conservative Christian family. And I remember feeling at the age of 8 or 10 or 12, I don't think I'm going to be able to last in this religion. And then I ended up having kind of a powerful spiritual experience in my teenage years and found myself with both feet on the path, but never feeling that I was totally fit inside the boxes that were given to me of what Christianity meant. And so that's been really my personal struggle. But what's happened in the course of my life is I went from feeling I was really an outlier among my generation to feeling that younger generations, every year that passed, more and more people were feeling the same way I had felt. And I think that really reached a kind of crescendo in 2016 with the election, and where Christians, especially white Christians, sort of fell out in the political scene. And I think since then that's only intensified to make especially young people, but surprising numbers of older people too, think I may not belong here anymore. So that set the stage for the book.
Yeah, and it's interesting because if you were to look out and kind of see characterization of Christianity, at least for me, it doesn't even reflect my own faith of the way that Christianity is being portrayed out in the public, right? And
Yeah.
and you give us good reason for why maybe it's okay to leave the church if people are feeling that way.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. Just this morning, I was just scanning through the news, and in my news feed came an article about a Russian Orthodox priest in a small town in Russia who had the courage to to his congregation right after the Russian invasion of Ukraine to say this is wrong.
Mm.
And within a few hours, the police were at his door to interrogate him, and he's been fined. And now he's continuing to speak out in social media. And he, one of his lines in the article was, apparently there's an old Russian saying, if you are afraid of the wolves, don't walk in the forest. And he
No.
basically was saying, look, I know what I'm doing. I know I'm taking a risk, but I have to do it. I'd have no integrity if I don't. So simultaneously, you have a courageous Russian Orthodox priest standing up to what's happening in Ukraine, and you have the head of the Russian Orthodox community, an arch supporter of Putin and everything that's happening. So that's just the paradox, that being a Christian means opposite things to one person and the next.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that you also talk about is being a Christian sometimes means you need to be oppositional.
Yes, yes. And I think, and the irony of this, we shouldn't be surprised, because this was what our founder was about. He said to his followers, look, you're probably going to get kicked out of your faith community. And when people kick you out, they will think they're doing God's work. They'll think they're serving God.
Yeah.
So he didn't vilify them and say these are evil people trying to do evil. They're people who think they're doing good. He was so realistic about these dynamics. And that's one of the reasons why I think he said, if 2 or 3 of you get together in my name, it's as if to say, you're going to feel you're sort of on the margins. And if you could just find 2 or 3 people, you'll be okay.
Right. No, that's really good. The book's divided in 3 sections. Part 1, you kind of give people some obvious reasons of why so many people are leaving the church, and kind of not really defending it, but just kind of saying, hey, I get it. And I really understand why you would feel this way. I'm going to gloss over that for today's discussion, just because I think we're all on the same page. Part 2, you talk about kind of the reasons why you believe that you're wanting to stay within the system. And then part 3 is about kind of creating a framework of next steps if you do decide to stay within the Christian system. And one of the things that you say, on page 100, you say, if I remain a Christian, I at least stand in religious solidarity with 85% of the world's population who identify as religious, be they Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, Jewish, or other. And each non-religious tradition has developed unique treasures, and its greatest honor is not to hide these treasures or dangle them as an enticement to convert, but rather to share them freely with one another. Now, I wish you would see my book, Brian, because you can barely read like the words on the book, because I've scribbled so many like notes in the margin, because, especially as somebody who teaches world religions, on a university level, I think one of the things that you're discussing sounds extremely dangerous, because what you're basically saying is that we can learn from other our cousins, religious cousins, and that we may not necessarily need to think about converting them. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Well, I believe in freedom of religion. So if people would like to convert, I think they have every right to convert. And if people feel their own religion is hurting them or stunting their growth or creating harm in the world, and they say, I think I'd be better off in this other one, I support that. And that's saying a lot for me, because I come from an evangelical background where everything was about conversion. And really, there was the whole idea that you make friends with people in order to convert them. The implication being that if you weren't trying to convert them, why would you ever want to associate with those people, right?
Yeah.
So that's the background I come from. But when you start or for me, when I started becoming honest about the failures of my own faith tradition, and I also became honest about the strengths of other faith traditions, that was the first thing that made me say, wouldn't it be nice if we could all be honest about our failures and offer one another our gifts?
Mm.
That just seems to me my the Jesus command to love your neighbor as yourself. That's what I wish my religious neighbors would do for me. Why wouldn't I want to do the same for them? Uh, the people who showed this to me the most in my own life were Buddhists and my Jewish friends as well. But I think first it hit me with Buddhists. I had when I was younger, I had many Buddhist friends. I still have a few, but I had a lot of Buddhist friends. I never had one of them try to get me to convert, but they loved to share with me stories of the Buddha or the Dharma, the teachings of Buddhism. And it was always offered to me as, you don't have to convert. This is just something that helps us. And if it helps you, you're welcome to have it. I thought that's the way I would like to be with my own Christian faith. But then one other thing that pushed me farther in this direction, and that is when I started to face the reality of global crises, climate change, the growing gap between rich and poor, the proliferation of weapons at all levels, from handguns to weapons of mass destruction. I realized no one religion can solve these problems alone. And if we care about our children and grandchildren, we better hope that generous elements of all of our religious traditions are willing to come together for the common good. So those two things together kind of push me in that direction.
Yeah, when I was reading that part of the book, one of the things that it reminded me of is Samir's book, It's All About God. The idea,
Yes.
both you and I know Samir, and it's, his idea that we should embrace the other and get to know them, not because we're trying to use them to convert them, but because we're genuinely interested in who they are as our neighbors.
When we're genuinely interested in our neighbor, I think we're being authentically Christian.
Mm.
And I think Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus and others could say the same thing. And so that allows us to try to encounter one another with genuine respect. And my first thought then is not, what religion are you? My first thought is, you're a fellow human being. We're already related.
I like that. You've heard of the saying, there's nothing new under the sun.
Yes.
So and the older I get, and as I have teenagers who discover new things, and they tell me, and I kind of laugh because it's stuff that I knew about like 30 years ago, but it's all new to me. Yeah. It's very rare that I feel like I have a new idea or concept until chapter 14 of your book. And Brian, I read it twice. I had to put the book down for like a full day. I just blew my mind about, you were talking about kind of the first axial and the second axial age. Yes. And you talk a lot about evolution, and giving us permission to believe in evolution and still believing in the existence of God. So can you talk about that a little bit? Because I know that, for me, with a fundamental, background that I grew up in, it was like it has to be airtight, because if you even let the air out a little bit, it's going to expand, and it's going to implode our world understanding or our worldview. And one of the things that you talk about is just the idea that the world could be millions of years old, and we can still be Christians with that belief.
Yes. So I don't think I think a lot of people don't slow down and pay attention to what happened in the last few hundred years. A lot of people have heard of someone named Adam Smith. He wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, which is seen as, in some ways, as the scripture of capitalism. Mm-hmm. Well, what Adam Smith was really saying that was so revolutionary was the wealth of nations can change. Nations can get richer, nations can get poorer. Because before this, people, and in Adam Smith's day, people had the idea of some are poor, some are rich. And and they might have even said, and that's decreed by God, and that's just the way it is. Mm-hmm. And that had huge implications on a personal level, because then you could say I was born poor in the lower classes, but then you could think I could change. So the possibility of change economically was a radical idea in the West. And then comes Charles Darwin. Change is happening in biology. And it really wasn't until about 100 years ago that Edwin Hubble, we know him from the Space Telescope, but his real groundbreaking or earth-shaking, almost literally, discovery was an expanding universe. The idea that the universe is expanding, because even then, many people had the idea that the universe was static and eternal. And when you find out that the universe is expanding, you can imagine putting it in rewind, and that's where you get to this idea of a Big Bang. You put all that together, and what you see is that in the matter of a couple of 100 years, the whole human species has to face the fact that everything is changing, everything is in motion, everything is in flux. Everything is in flux. And if God is the creator of this universe, then suddenly it makes us say, if the universe was spoken into existence by the word of God. And of course, I think this is all incredibly powerful, metaphorical, poetic language. But the word of God, let there be light, it means that light expresses who God is, and darkness expresses who God is. And whales and mountain lions and hummingbirds express who God is, and each of us expresses who God is. And if that's the case, then change, that God is not static, God is dynamic. And if anyone, and that is a foreign idea to a lot of Christians, because they inherited a huge dose of Greek philosophy. They don't know it, but hidden in a lot of Christian theology was Greek philosophy. And the Jews didn't see it this way. The ancient Jews had a very different worldview than the Greeks. And I think the way I like to say it is that I think the Jewish idea of good is better than the Greek idea of perfect, because perfect is static and stagnant, and good is dynamic and creative. And so this opens up a revolution in Christian theology that I think is so exciting, but for some people it's quite terrifying. And I understand, because I think I was probably terrified by it the first time I heard about it too.
One of the things you say, like, let's just say we were on a continuum of 0 to 100, in the planet's history. One of the things that you say is, like, we're basically at like 2.
Yeah.
And so if we're so early on in the formation of the of not just the planet, but then even of Christianity and religion and understanding spirituality, why would you give up so quickly when we're at the early onset of the formation of our faith?
Yeah. Yes. And this actually plays back into this Greek philosophical idea that I think gets us in trouble, because one of the ideas that the Greeks had, I think you could say it like this, and it wasn't unique to the Greeks, I'm sure others had it too, but it was the idea that the highest and best form of something is its earliest form. So that when something's created, it's perfect. And then over time, it might deteriorate and decay. Whenever you hear people use the phrase slippery slope, they're playing into this idea that we start at the top of the mountain and we could be sliding down. But what evolution says, and I actually think what metaphorically the first chapters of Genesis say, is we don't start at the top of a slope of perfection. We start in a good world, and part of its goodness is that it continues to develop and evolve and change and make new possibilities. So we could say it like this: when the world was created, there was no Mozart, there was no Bob Dylan, there was no Taylor Swift. Those were goodnesses that were going to come a lot later, and so new goodnesses keep erupting in this universe, and that to me is a sign of whatever we mean when we say the word God. We're pointing out to this idea that God's creativity it just keeps unfolding.
That's so beautiful. It's it was mind-blowing for me. And one of the things that I probably circled, 200 times in your book are just all the different authors that you were citing, and people that you're reading, Catholics, Protestants, ancient Talmud, 18th, 19th century slave writers. And do you have like a writing assistant, a researcher, or somebody, Brian? Like, how are you
Yeah.
pulling all this stuff together?
No, I just am a solo operation here, but I'll tell you what happens after you start writing is you write something and then somebody sends you an email and they say, hey, did you know that James Baldwin said almost exactly what you're saying? And then somebody else says, hey, did you hear the backstory to Christopher Columbus who you mentioned in this lecture? And so people, all my readers become my teachers. And so I guess you could say I have hundreds of thousands of research assistants in that
Yeah.
way over the years. Yeah.
That's pretty amazing. One of the other reasons why you say that, you're going to stay a Christian is because of our legendary leader, Jesus Christ. And I kind of raised my eyebrows because I was kind of like, really? Jesus? And, I had to really kind of do some introspection about who Jesus is and what did Jesus really do. And I think, like one of the things I would be interested in doing is taking kind of copying and pasting just the red letters out of the New Testament and putting it into a different document, and then just read that without the context of the Sermon on the Mount or a conversation, with a widow, and just see exactly what Jesus was saying. But because I think what has happened, especially as preachers have tried to be creative and kind of use theatrical language, is that we've recreated Jesus to be somebody and something that he may not have come to this earth as. And I know you talk a lot about this in your book, The Secret Message of Jesus. But what is it about Jesus, our legendary founder, that makes you want to stay connected? Yeah. Hey guys, this is Kumar, your concierge minister. I want to just let you know that I would be honored to record a prayer for you so that you can listen to it anytime that you're discouraged or you need some encouragement. Just send me a message at conciergeminister@gmail.com with your phone number and what you want me to pray for you about, whether it's a blessing, whether it's for forgiveness, whether you want to just expand the possibilities for God to enlarge your life with abundance. This is free of charge, no gimmicks, no hassle. Just shoot me a note and I will send you a personalized prayer for you so you can hang on to when you need some hope in your life.
It's such a obvious and clear question, and the answer is I'm sure I'll stumble and struggle in trying to answer. So let me first say that one of the reasons I love Jesus is because I don't think you could take his statements and just put them in a book, and the statements alone would be that compelling. What makes them compelling is when you have some understanding of his time and his context. In other words, I don't think Jesus is giving a lot of timeless truths and making statements about things that are universally across history accurate. I think he does probably in a lot of ways, but I think what makes his statements so electric and alive is when you put him in the context of Judea and Galilee in the first century, in somewhere around AD 25 or 30, whenever it was. And here is a young man who grows up in this setting, a setting where group is pitted against group, where the society is deeply divided. I know it's hard for us to imagine living in such a world so deeply divided. But you've got the Romans, and then the Romans are ruling over the Jews, and you've got all these parties. We think of those of us who read the Bible a lot, we think of these as religious groups, but they were really political parties. The Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Herodians, the Zealots, they were political parties. And they were out, many of them were out killing each other, and they were in a contest to see who was going to win the day. And so Jesus, I think you understand him living in that context. And what he does is, instead of getting embroiled in those debates only on their level, he sort of steps to a higher level and gives people a vision of something that they hadn't imagined yet. And he, in a sense, blows open the little box that they're in and says, you live in a bigger cosmos than you realize. And God is different than you think. I mean, really, Jesus' vision of God is so different than anybody thought at the time. And so when I look at Jesus in that context, I just think here is someone who took us to open the door to a whole new way of being human.
Yeah, and his message was just kind of almost like lighting the wick. It wasn't kind of just, this is Jesus, his 3.5 years on earth, and now it's over, and we can just act like it's finished.
In fact, that really relates to what we were talking about earlier, because a lot of us, the version of Christianity we were taught was, oh, Jesus got it, it was perfect, and everything now is sort of a step down. Or our goal is to be conservative, to always go back. Many of us were part of restorationist churches that tried to restore the church to its original purity. All that kind of talk fits in with that philosophy. But that's not what Jesus said. Jesus says, listen, guys, it's way better for you that I leave. And the Spirit's going to guide you. There's a whole lot of stuff you're not ready for. You'll be guided into that when you're ready. He very literally, clearly says, that I'm not giving the last word. I'm getting something started, and there's a whole lot more for you to learn. He even says, that you're going to do greater things than I did. I mean, there's one that you wouldn't dare to say if that weren't in the text. So all that's to say, I think this isn't in anybody's creed, but one of the things that I think is most fundamentally true about Jesus is that he was a movement leader. And the electricity at the heart of that spiritual, political, ecological, social, economic movement is still inspiring people today.
I love that. It reminds me, a couple of weeks ago, I attended a musical at the Olney Theater.
Yes, I remember the Olney Theater.
And it was actually what they billed it as the world premiere of a play that they had put together, and they did workshopping it, and it was called 16 AD. And it was the love story between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And it was a musical, and they put it in a 16 AD at a perfect time, because it's kind of the period of time that we don't know anything about Jesus. And so it gives them a creative license. And it's about Mary Magdalene really loving Jesus and having a crush on him, and him trying to change the world, but trying to just figure out new things. And so, he tells a story about, the Good Samaritan, for example, and all the lepers are listening to him. And Mary Magdalene says, well, I'm more interested, about what happened to the guy on the road. And Jesus says, well, really, that's not the point. It's really about the religious people. And then she goes, well, I think the story would be more interesting if you talked about the need to help the guy on the road. And Jesus goes, yeah, let me workshop that a little bit. Let me think about that. And there's numerous times in the play where Jesus is kind of working things out, and he hasn't fully figured it out. And there was a part of me that was like laughing, and there was a part of me that was cringing and hoping no one knew that I was sitting there watching the play. But what I loved about that is the creative imagination to actually be willing to think outside of what we've been given down as traditional to traditional doctrines. And when we're able to really look at the Bible as an open text, it gives us permission to really kind of see what Jesus is really saying in the narrative.
Yes. So true. So true. And to just put a sort of a fine point on that, according to 3 of the Gospels anyway, Jesus' favorite term to describe himself was not Son of God. That's other people's favorite term. And that term had a political meaning. We think of it as a
Mm.
religious term with sort of Trinitarian meaning or whatever. But in Jesus' day, Son of God had it had a political meaning.
Mhm.
But his favorite term for himself was Son of Man. And
Mm.
I was part of a project once that we were asked to do a paraphrase, kind of a scholarly paraphrase of the New Testament. It was called The Voice, and they chose a different writer for a different contemporary writer for each New Testament writer. So I
Mm.
got paired up with Luke.
Oh,
So it
wow.
meant that I worked with the Gospel of Luke and Acts. And one of the things I had to do in the Gospel of Luke is deal with these different phrases like Christ
Mm.
or the phrase Son of Man. And what became clear to me as I really wrestled with that phrase and got to be kind of a theological nerd and dive deep in the literature was to realize that, well, first of all, son of means a new generation of, and man
Mm.
means humanity.
Mm.
So for Jesus to say, I'm a new generation of humanity, I'm trying to be a new kind of human being. This is the
Wow.
way I understand myself.
Wow.
The current kind of human being is violent, greedy, all the rest. I'm trying to model a different way of being a human being. Uh, yeah, that becomes to me like I don't think that makes Jesus less interesting. I think it
Right.
makes Jesus way more. And so there you saw it in that
Yeah.
play.
Yeah, I love that. Um, you when you first started out 20 years ago, kind of in the mainstream, Christian press, you were kind of known as the father of postmodernism. And they and I tried to really kind of peg you, as that. And somehow, you were able to kind of keep moving, and then you took on this huge mantle of social justice, and really we're writing about that and commenting on that. Um, in this book in particular, there's a theme that's kind of woven from page one to the very last page, and that is kind of this eco-theology that exists. And one of the things that you say in part 3 of the book is, look, whether you stay a Christian or not, let's just say you don't stay a Christian, let's all work together
Yeah.
to care for this beautiful planet.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that and why that is so much in your forefront of your thinking and writing these days.
Yeah. Well, the short answer is it's existential threat. It's I would say our two greatest and most immediate existential threats are nuclear war, which seemed somewhat distant 3 months ago,
Mm-hmm.
but in recent weeks now it's on everybody's front page, uh, and then the other is climate change, and climate change and nuclear war go together, because if you create the amount of instability that 1 meter or 2 meters or 3 meters of sea level rise will unleash on the earth, then it's not hard to imagine people being desperate enough that nuclear war could be even more likely than it is with just idiotic, arrogant, narcissistic leaders who would do things out of spite or arrogance. Now it becomes a situation of global desperation.
Yeah.
So that's the obvious answer, but it really ties back to something we talked about earlier, and that is what I see Jesus doing. He frames his message in light of the most serious threats that his people faced. I don't think too many people were thinking about global threats
Mm-hmm.
in AD 30, but Jesus was facing an existential threat, and it was that his compatriots would have a violent revolution against the Romans.
Mm.
And Jesus was not a fan of Roman domination, but he knew if there was a violent revolution, he knew the power of Rome. In fact, it's never told in the Bible, but when Jesus was a boy, if he was growing up in Nazareth, a few miles from Nazareth was a town called Sephora, and there was an uprising, and the Romans crucified, I forget how many people, but I think thousands of men were crucified, kind of a mass slaughter of
Mm-hmm.
anyone who could possibly be a rebel. So Jesus grows up with this threat that the Romans, that we could have a revolution and the Romans could come in and crush us. And I think so much of Jesus' teaching is saying, here's how to survive. We don't have to submit to the Romans, but there's a way to uphold our dignity without thinking that a violent revolution is going to solve all our problems.
Mm, mm. You know, I grew up in the faith tradition of the Seventh-day Adventist denomination, and you know, we're really obsessed with the Sabbath.
Yes.
You know, and I know Seventh-day Adventists very, very well, but you know, our claim to fame and the one thing that we kind of hinge everything on is the Sabbath. So in many ways, the Sabbath has become our Jesus in many ways.
Yes.
I mean, we worship the Sabbath before, you know, in many ways than Jesus. And I've been preaching for years that if we really fully believed and understood what the significance of the Sabbath, when God says, remember the seventh
Yes.
day, right?
Yes.
Over and over again, it's a commemoration of creation.
Yes.
And so Seventh-day Adventists, by all people, should be the most staunch conservative creationists who are trying to save the planet and remember God's creation. And I just wish, you know, that we would understand that, you know, that idea of Sabbath keeping is creation tending. And, you know, it would make such a huge difference.
It really would. And it speaks brilliantly to our contemporary struggle, and that climate change is one symptom of, and that is that we believe that the more money you make, the faster is always good.
Yeah.
And the way you make money is by converting long-term natural assets, mountains, rivers, streams, soil, converting long-term natural assets into short-term personal profits or corporate profits.
Yeah.
And in a sense, the Sabbath, the idea of the Sabbath says, hey, we don't need to maximize income. We're willing right from the start to drop 1/7 of our potential income.
Right.
So
yes.
Income is not God.
Right.
know?
Right.
And oh my, it's so powerful. It is so powerful. You're right. And the idea that on the seventh day is the day that God says everything is good, and everything is very good.
Yeah.
And again, I know so many people think you have to take this literally. I think it's so much more meaningful when we take it metaphorically and poetically, because there's no way to talk about spiritual things other than poetry and metaphor, really.
Yeah. Yeah.
But to say that for human beings to be part of the whole, it's not human beings apart from the whole, it's human beings part of the whole. And that vision we desperately need again too.
Wow. I love that. So Brian, I know as you're talking about that theme in your book, you're not just trying to get me to recycle. You know, that's a good start. I mean, what do you want the reader to do when we talk about saving and salvaging our planet?
Yeah. Well, look, the first thing that I would always say is every little thing that we can do it. But the world will not be saved by that. And this might shock people to hear me say this, but the truth is all of the solutions that we need are available. They really are. They weren't 20 years ago. They really are available today, but we don't have politicians who have the courage to stand up to the people who are making money from the ways that are destroying the earth. So it would mean everybody would make a commitment to vote for candidates who care about the earth, and to refuse to vote for candidates who are, who are making their money from donations from people who are destroying the earth. So that would be one thing. But I'll tell you the other thing. I think one of the most important things we can do is invite people to make caring for the earth part of everyday discussion. So someone says, how are you doing today? Well, I'm doing great, except I read the report from the climate experts, and they're telling us we got a lot of work to do. So I carry that with me every day. They just drop that in a conversation, you know. And it doesn't always have to be, Debbie Downer of talking about what's wrong. It also means celebrating when you hear somebody did something good, or some corporation did something good, or some politician did something good. One of the sports for around the country, but especially where you live, is bashing politicians. And so it wouldn't hurt us all to say, we always hear somebody bashing politicians in general or in particular. And then I might say, yeah, there's a lot of corrupt ones out there. Boy, I'm sure grateful for Senator Whitehouse of Rhode Island, who really cares about the environment and addresses that in all of his work. I'm so inspired by him. You just have a positive thing to come back with that gets people thinking about this.
Yeah, I like that, being an advocate. You ready for some quick questions?
Absolutely.
Who are you reading these days? Like, who are the people that I should be taking note of?
Well, I work at the Center for Action and Contemplation part-time, and two of my fellow faculty, obviously Richard Rohr is there, who's amazing, and his work is wonderful. But one of the delights for me, Richard and I have been friends for over 20 years, but I've gotten to know Jim Finley, or Dr. James Finley, and Dr. Barbara Holmes. And Jim Finley and Barbara Holmes have some really amazing books, very, very different, but really amazing. And so those would be some I'd recommend. I'm actually right now reading, it's not published yet, but I'm reading the manuscript Jim sent me of his memoir, which is just incredible. And so those would be two. Gosh, I should just look at my desk here. I have so many. I'm actually reading, I just started this very important book, After Jesus, Before Christianity. And it's a really important book. It's for someone like yourself who appreciates Bart Ehrman. This is in that category. It's going to challenge people to see that from the time of Jesus' death till what we call Christianity comes to be, there's a very dynamic period that's very different than people would assume just looking back. You have to sort of you have to go back in time and look forward instead of interpret everything through what happened later.
I like that. What do you watch on Netflix right now?
Oh gosh, I went through all the series that I liked. I'm a big science fiction fan, so I've been watching, any of the science fiction series. But what I actually probably watch more than anything else these days is YouTube. So,
okay, that's
but
hilarious.
I was a huge fan. It wasn't Netflix, but I was a huge fan of The Expanse, and I finally got through the last available season of that.
Oh, okay, very, very nice. Are you already working on your next writing project?
No. Well, I should say I have two writing projects that I'd like to begin in about a year.
Okay.
But I mentioned science fiction because I've already finished the first draft of a science fiction novel that I hope will be the next thing I publish, but we'll see.
Very cool.
If it's publishers are very nervous when they have writers who write primarily nonfiction. They're very nervous about them trying fiction. They're afraid it's really going to stink, Right.
So. Try to cross over.
Yeah.
That is awesome. Hey man, thanks for joining me. I love the book. It's coming out in May. And I'm definitely thinking this is a book that, church groups, small groups need to be reading together and discussing and digesting together. Don't just read this book on your own like I did. You got to really have someone to talk about this and really kind of process some of the things that Brian has been suggesting in the book. So Brian, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Kumar.
Thanks for listening to the Concierge Minister podcast. If you want to learn more about growing in your faith or looking for an online faith community for support while you're on your journey, please visit conciergeminister.com or send us an email at conciergeminister@gmail.com. Don't forget to click the subscribe button and give us a 5-star rating. If you find this podcast helpful, please tell your friends about us. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, go and live your best life.